Hello and welcome back to the EV Life podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Maharaj, and I'm joined by Allison Bench, our producer.
Hi, Crystal. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you on as always. We have another exciting episode coming up today.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about today's guest and what we're going to be hearing about.
Yeah, so we're talking to David Layzell. So David is a professor at the University of Calgary, but he's also the director of a program there called CESAR, and it stands for the Canadian Energy Systems Analysis Research. He also helped found a not-for-profit Canadian organization that's working towards identifying net zero energy solutions, and that's called Transition Accelerator. And he talks a little bit about both of those initiatives in our interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just so interesting to hear kind of what the experts and scientists at the University of Calgary are kind of up to. It's just, we talk to so many people on this podcast, and there's just so many things happening out there.
There are lots of avenues that you can really explore when it comes to EVs. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we talk about something, again, like I mentioned, we haven't really covered this before, but David, in his research, they're looking at various types of alternative fuel to gasoline, right? So net zero energy solutions. And so he shares a bit about EVs and how those batteries work. And then he also talks about hydrogen fuel cell. And then he gets into why one might be better for a particular type of vehicle versus the other. And I've never had it explained that way because I've often wondered, well, why electric batteries? Why not hydrogen fuel cells or vice versa? And he really explains why hydrogen fuel cells works well for some vehicles and not in others.
Yeah. And, on this podcast, we have talked so much about the kind of traditional style plug-in electric vehicle. And so it's so interesting to learn a little bit more about the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. So yeah, I think we should just jump into that interview and hear what there is to learn about those.
Yeah, let's go. Here's my interview with David Layzell. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining me today on the EV Life podcast.
My pleasure.
Well, we're here to talk about, our podcast is all about EVs, but you do some interesting work when it comes to EVs, and it's a little bit different than anyone we've spoken to so far. So are you able to tell our audience a little bit about the research that you do at the University of Calgary?
Certainly. Well, I moved to the University of Calgary about 15 years ago to lead an interdisciplinary research institute called ICE. That means the Institute for Sustainable Energy, Environment, and Economy. And what it did is bring together researchers from numerous departments and faculties across campus to identify economically viable, environmentally friendly solutions for Alberta's energy production and use. And about 10 years ago, in 2013, I left ICE. Mm-hmm. And I set up my own research group at the University of Calgary called CESAR, Canadian Energy Systems Analysis Research. We love acronyms.
Yeah, I was just going to say very creative acronyms.
So, now it actually, CESAR had the same overall objective as ICE, but it was focused on using detailed techno-economic analyses and modeling tools to identify transition pathways from the energy systems that we have today to a net zero emission energy systems and we really were looking for net zero emission energy systems that would work for all parts of Canada, including Alberta. Mm-hmm. And so the work we did in CESAR, and this is 2013 to more or less 2019, was quite exciting, and in that it showed that the transition from traditional fossil carbon-based energy carriers, we're thinking now gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, natural gas,
right,
to zero-emission energy carriers, so that's like electricity or hydrogen or biofuels, was not the nightmare scenario for Alberta and for Canada that it's often described as.
Okay, I'm interested.
It was quite the opposite. Alberta and Canada, on any international basis and across North America, are poised to be major winners in such a transition. So this was kind of the work in by 2018, 2019. It was very clear that there was this transition pathway that was really actually quite promising for Alberta and for Canada and for many or most of the provinces. But I was coming close to retiring from the university, and I really wanted to see this CESAR work not only continue, but to expand across Canada. And this opinion was shared by the organizations that were funding CESAR. And so I worked with some like-minded colleagues in Ontario and Quebec, and we launched what's called a Transition Accelerator.
Okay.
And it's really about how do we accelerate the transition to a net zero emission energy system and economy. And we launched that nonprofit in 2019 and started to attract funding for it and to started a bunch of projects, many of them looking at electrification of our transportation system, electrification of space heating and industrial processes, but also the role that where electrification doesn't work very well, we looked at what are the other alternatives, whether it's biofuels or hydrogen. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing, and one of the big opportunities, I think, in Western Canada is in the space of how do you make zero emission fuels using our resources that we have in Western Canada.
Right.
And actually, where do they fit best within the energy system of the future? And how does Alberta and the rest of Canada fit competitively with other countries in being able to produce and use these new zero emission energy carriers that are climate friendly?
So just to clarify for our listeners, so CESAR was a part of a research organization that was a part of the UFC, the University of Calgary. Transition Accelerator is not. That's its own standalone not-for-profit?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And you mentioned the funding partners. Are you able to share who those funding partners are?
Well, we have a number of different funding partners now. We started with philanthropic organizations like the Ivy Foundation, the McConnell Foundation. There was a number of other private foundations across Canada that were very interested in finding climate change solutions and in finding ones that actually would be good for the economy, that would create the jobs, and they became very interested in the work that we and a few others were doing because we were actually interested in finding transition pathways that would actually allow us to achieve our climate change goals and get to zero emission energy carriers, but at the same time actually position Canada in a very positive economic position and in a way that again would create jobs and hope for the future. So our funders now actually extend to many governments, provincial and federal government organizations, but also we're often hired by industry associations that are interested in looking at net zero solutions for their particular industries and how they're going to address the transition to low carbon economy in the future.
Right. And I understand that you focus a lot on hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, which are called FCEVs.
Fuel cell electric vehicles. Yeah.
Yeah. And on our podcast, we talk primarily about the battery electric vehicles. So can you just explain a little bit about what the difference between those two are?
Well, both of them are electric vehicles, which means they use electric motors to turn the wheels. It's a lot of it's where the electricity comes from. In a battery electric vehicle, typically it comes from grid power, where you plug your car in and charge the batteries, and then the batteries will take you a distance. And when the battery starts getting drained, or when you're parked overnight, you can plug it in again, and it'll be ready for you the next morning. In a fuel cell electric vehicle, you also typically have batteries, a bank of batteries, maybe not as many batteries as an electric vehicle, but your power generation is the electricity is generated on board from a chemical energy carrier. So one can use hydrogen, for example, and put the hydrogen through a fuel cell. The fuel cell then converts the chemical energy in the hydrogen into electrical energy, and the electrical energy can use to either drive the wheels directly, so you can actually send the electrical energy directly to the motors and drive the wheels, or you can send the electrical energy to the battery and store some of the electricity in the batteries for when it could be needed. Maybe you have to climb a hill later and you want to store a little bit extra electricity in the battery. in order to get you up the next hill and still have lots of energy left. So there's a whole energy management system on board a fuel cell electric vehicle.
Right.
There's pros and cons to these vehicles. The benefit of a battery electric vehicle is that the electricity is quite low cost compared to any alternative. It's certainly a lower cost of the electricity, even from grid electricity, or even if you actually get a recharging station where you're paying for all the recharger. That electricity is typically lower cost than hydrogen, for example, as a fuel to generate the electricity. So that's a benefit. For smaller vehicles, lighter weight vehicles, or vehicles that are going to travel relatively short distances, for example, delivery vehicles, so you could be talking mail trucks or vehicles delivering packages from Amazon or whatever, they probably makes the most sense for them to be battery electric. But as when you get to heavier vehicles, and especially long distance transport, where you really want a vehicle to be driving, a truck to be driving, say, 700, 800,000 kilometers a day, where you want really rapid refueling. The problem with battery electric vehicles is they tend to take longer to recharge than putting a chemical on board a vehicle and moving forward. And also the weight of the vehicles is a problem. If you're wanting to drive very long distances, one needs to have so much, the weight of the batteries would really start to compromise the amount of freight that one could carry in a large truck, for example. So it's an issue about speed of refueling and charging, the range that you can take the vehicle before you have to go back in and refuel or recharge, and the overall the weight of the vehicles. All of those tend to point to big, heavy-duty vehicles, for example, that involved in long-distance transport across Canada, or moving intercity movement of large amounts of freight. Then those tend to be battery electric vehicles don't work very well, and even when you look forward, you have a hard time seeing in a forward-looking view of battery electric vehicles being able to serve that market effectively. And so that's why a lot of the major trucking companies are starting to make hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, or even there's some countries, and especially if you're looking at heavy-duty trucking, but also trains, for example, or ships, or off-road vehicles that might be, say, mining vehicles, etc. Those are often looking at hydrogen fuel cell electric as well, or sometimes ammonia fuel cell electric, which is a really interesting technology. There's a company called Emoji that's recently come out with a number of very interesting technologies where the chemical they store on the vehicle is ammonia, which is made from hydrogen. So you make hydrogen, then you make ammonia. You can store ammonia. It's more volumetrically dense, so you can store more in a smaller space than you can hydrogen. And then you convert the ammonia to hydrogen just right on board the vehicle. And then the hydrogen goes through what's an alkaline fuel cell, produces the electricity, and that drives the motor. So it actually uses a different storage and allows longer vehicles and heavier duty long range. So they're looking at ammonia, and Emoji and other companies are looking at ammonia for big ships, for trains, for heavy duty trucks, and off-road vehicles. Even agricultural vehicles, they've got tractors and that kind of stuff.
So you explain why, the battery electric vehicles don't really work for those long distance transport vehicles. But I know that there have been a few manufacturers that have made hydrogen fuel cell light duty passenger vehicles. Do you think more manufacturers will use that technology, or do you think that the battery electric vehicles are just kind of the best option for those light duty passenger vehicles?
I think there's an option, and a lot of it depends on this convergence of a variety of technologies. For example, we also have happening within the world today is this movement towards AI, or sort of artificial intelligence, and the movement towards autonomous vehicles. And they've been talking about this for the last 5 to 10 years, the possibility of moving towards fleets of vehicles that could actually drive without requiring a driver. Now, when you actually move into that kind of a world where artificial intelligence could actually mean that there's a fleet of vehicles that one could assign up and get sort of a plan with to give you so many thousands of kilometers a year of personal transport. So when you want to go to shopping, or you want to go visit a friend, or you want to, go to a theater or something, you would just pull out your phone, a vehicle, you would call a vehicle, it would drive up, pick you up, take you to where you want to go, drop you off. You don't have to pay for parking because the vehicle's off to the next customer.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
It would be very nice. And I've been dreaming about this and actually studying this for a number of years.
Oh,
and,
nice.
But we don't have, the technology is not quite there yet. But in that kind of a technology, a small light duty vehicle could replace 8 or more personally owned vehicles. But the vehicles that replacing it, instead of driving, say, 15,000 kilometers a year, it might drive 150 or 200,000 kilometers a year. Mm-hmm. And these vehicles will be maybe in use 16 hours a day or more. And the desire there, and of course, and the economics of this is quite compelling if you actually have vehicles that could do that. But you'd want those vehicles on the road all the time. So bringing them back in to recharge during the middle of the day would be loss of income.
Right.
And so that's one example. That's a more extreme example. More closer to where we are today is many of the hydrogen fuel cell for light duty vehicles are really being assigned to, for example, taxi service.
Okay,
where
yeah.
you have a fleet of taxis that, they're still human driven, but, you want especially if, airport taxis, that sort of thing, where the taxis are out, they need to pick you from the airport, take you to where you dropping people off at the airport, picking people up from the airport. Those fleets, because they're all coming back to an airport, they could have a fueling station for hydrogen. And that could be some early markets for hydrogen vehicles. I would say, even though, some of my colleagues would disagree with me, but I find it difficult. I have an electric car, a battery electric. I don't see any sense in me having a fuel cell electric car, even though I work on fuel cell vehicles.
Right.
Just because, it's very convenient to just charge it overnight. Typically most of us, if you have a personally owned vehicle, we use it less than 5% of the time. 95% of the time it's parked.
Right.
And when it's parked, depending on where you are, you can recharge it. And and if you need to recharge, there's recharging stations around, and there are more of them going in. That makes more sense. Mm-hmm. But then again, not all light duty vehicles are personally owned. Some of them have very heavy workloads.
So I guess it kind of depends on the use for the vehicle, right? And if it can go a little bit longer, I guess the need for having to recharge quickly. Exactly.
And it's on a fast charger, one can charge an electric vehicle quite quickly, but it's still, if you're running a trucking company and, we're talking batteries on an electric truck, a heavy duty electric truck that could be 5 times more than, say, on a Tesla, right? Mm-hmm. So charging that amount of batteries, that's what you're going to need in order to take this vehicle any significant distance. I'm sure you could go to even super fast chargers.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I think we learned so much from you about hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And again, this is the first time that we're talking about this topic on the podcast. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing a little bit about your research.
My pleasure.
And before I let you go, one last question that we like to ask a lot of our guests who come on is, when you think of the future of transportation, is there one thing in particular that you're really excited to see?
So I guess the answer to that, I'm very excited about the possibility of maintaining the transportation. The transportation is an incredible opportunity, and like our generation has, and Canada has at this time, that many previous generations before us never had the benefits the ease of transportation, to be able to move around our communities and around the world in ways. I really want to maintain that ability to move around, but we have to be able to find a way of doing it without damaging our climate and our environment in such a way. So I'm very interested in that. I'm also quite excited about the integration of this transition of transportation to a greener, lower carbon transportation, but also making the movement towards autonomous transport and artificial intelligence and that transition. And I think there's a really interesting synergy between electrification with different sources, ways of making the electricity, and the movement to artificial intelligence and more automation of that transportation that I think could actually improve the quality of life of Canadians as well as the environment.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much, David. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of EV Life. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with David Layzell. If you'd like to join the conversation or chime in on your own thoughts around EVs and net zero energy solutions, you can find Allison and myself in the EV Life group on the AMA mobile app. Download the app and join our group, and we look forward to talking to you. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen to your podcast so you never miss an episode. We'll talk to you next week.